So I would just like to welcome Karen Kudlick, who is the director of the Longmore Institute on Disability and a professor of history at San Francisco State University. Thank you.
So welcome everybody. This is really exciting. And to be here at the screening of Gattaca 20 years on. And as she said, I'm Karen Kudlick. I'm director of the Longmore Institute on Disability at San Francisco State. And one of the things that we do as the kind of our mission in the world is to show that disability is a creative and interesting force, and the world is better because of disabled people. And tonight's screening, I think, is a really interesting counter message to the normal messages about disability, showing that what happens if you eliminate all disability, which is in some ways the dream of the world, and how that dream can be really a bigger problem than you would think. Tonight's event is presented by our the Superfest International Disability Film Festival that we run through San Francisco State. We're also very excited to be partnering with the Center for Genetics and Society, which is a wonderful organization based in Berkeley that's studying the implications of a lot of these technologies. Also the Haas Institute for a Fair and Inclusive Society at UC Berkeley, they're partners in this as well. And of course, the San Francisco Public Library and Access Services. I want to especially acknowledge the captioner and the ASL interpreters on this side of the room, and then on the other side of the room we have the audio describer, and they add an element of creativity and interest and extra features to the film because they provide access to it for people that may miss something or may need something or whatever. It's showing disability creativity in action, really. I wanted to say a couple of words to frame the film tonight, just some things for you to think about. Tonight, unlike, this is the second screening of the film. Tuesday night we had a screening over in Berkeley that focused on the genetics and some of the scientific and the bioethical aspects of the story. Tonight we're going to focus on the disability angle of the story of Gattaca, which is often overlooked, even though disability, as you'll see, is central to the whole story. And at the core, I think, of everything are ideas of ableism and normalcy. And one of the best definitions of ableism I've ever heard was the belief that it's better not to be disabled. It's very simple, very concise, and I think this film shows what happens when that belief is at the core of everything. And not far away from that is the notion of normalcy. And that's linked to ableism, but it's not the same thing. And I really want you to kind of approach the film with these questions in mind as you watch it. So disability brings value and variety and all of that. That's the flip side of what's not being talked about in the film. The film's talking about what's taken away, but think about the world, how it would be better, if we could embrace the kind of difference that disability brings. I have a couple of questions, 2 questions I want you to think about as you're watching the film. First is, what's the ultimate message about disability in the film tonight? What really is the ultimate message about disability? What do you come away with? Is there a clear message? And then the second one is, what does resistance look like then and now? So without further ado, when you think about disability, think about the ultimate message, think about resistance, and think about watching a very provocative and fascinating film. Thank you.
So I am Karen Nakamura. I am the posture and disability studies and professor of anthropology at UC Berkeley, and I was asked if I could moderate this panel. Actually, that's a lie. I asked if I asked them if I could moderate this panel, because it is such an incredible kick-ass panel of scholars and activists, and it's just going to be amazing to have this conversation. So I have the opportunity to introduce people. So I'm going to introduce them, and then we'll launch into our discussion. So I'm going to start off To my right is Sara Acevedo, who's the founding member of the National Coalition for Latinx with Disabilities. She's adjunct faculty, and this is the really good news. She was a doctoral candidate. She's now in the liminal status. She just finished passing her defense, and so almost some close PhD of anthropology at the California Institute of Integral Studies. Then one more to my right is Marcy Darnovsky, who's the executive director of the Center for Genetics and Society. If I read Marcy's CV and biography, all the works she's done, and all the places she's appeared in, all the newspaper articles, all the television shows, it would be an hour and 45 minutes. But the most recent book she's done is with one of our professors. It's called Beyond Bioethics, Towards a New Biopolitics. And you can actually see the book out. The cover is beautiful. It's out in the lobby. Then one more to the right is Lawrence Carter-Long, who we are so happy, because I don't know how it happened, but we managed to snag Lawrence from New York. And so he's now heading up he's the communications director at DREDF after spending a long time working for one of the organizations for disabled people in New York. He's also been 6 years on the National Council on Disability. He's won numerous awards. I'm sorry, it's very hard. People have very long.
I'm a movie nerd and I do stuff.
And he's amazing. So the Too Long Didn't Read is Lawrence Carter-Long is absolutely amazing, and we are absolutely thrilled that he is now part of us.
Thrilled to be here.
Then we have Dominika Bednarska, who's a performer, a writer, an intellectual, a poet. Most recently, she's been doing a one-person show called My Body, a love story. And hopefully there'll be opportunities where you can see that. And then finally, we have Kathy Kudlick, who is absolutely singular. She's the director of the Longmore Institute, a historian at San Francisco State, and brings us the Superfest Festival each year, which I think is one of the most important disability cultural events. So we have a big panel. I thought we would just start off with, I think many of us, we get sucked into Gattaca, and then many of us in the disability community, and fish at the end is like, what the heck? So, I think my first question to the panelists, and just let me know who wants to grab it, is what kind of disability film is Gattaca? How the heck are we supposed to understand this film? So does anyone want to start us off?
All right, I'll jump in. So you folks may not know that a few years back, I did a project with Turner Classic Movies where I looked at films about disability from the silent era through 1990 when the ADA was passed. So 80 years of cinematic history to do a festival called The Projected Image, a history, not the history, a history of disability on film. A lot of things became pretty obvious as you sit down and watch movies from one decade to the next. One of the things that was really most striking to me, watching 237 movies to decide 20 that we could show as part of the festival, was that in almost every film, I'm talking 99%, disability always happened in isolation. What you had was a situation where disabled people didn't seem to know any other disabled people, didn't hang out with any other disabled people, didn't learn anything from any other disabled people. It was always sort of the disabled person against the entire world. This movie falls into that genre. It didn't break new ground. Right? It's pretty much like every other movie about disability that's ever been made in that regard. So it's following a time-honored, or maybe not honored, but at least a time-tested tradition in terms of its depiction. I have a couple of questions, though, that sort of came to mind upon seeing it again. So we're 20 years past the making of this film. 20 years closer to the not so distant future, right? And the questions that I have are, what the hell happened to universal design, right? The architecture hasn't gotten any better, the planning hasn't gotten any better, inclusion hasn't gotten any better. Look at that damn staircase, everybody had to, go up and down. So that's one question. Another question that I have is, what do they do to people who get injured? Are they sent off to some gulag in North Korea? Are they shipped off to Jupiter? Like, what happens to them? Do people get, age in the society? We only saw really the older cop and Gordy Doll. That was it. Yeah. And so it's like, what kind of future is this? And do I want to be a part of this kind of place? Because it doesn't seem, it's sort of presented in a weird way, kind of like a utopia, but it's not any utopia that I would want to be a part of. It looks pretty damn boring to me. So those are my initial thoughts.
Anyone else want to pick up on what kind of disability film is this?
Well, I didn't see it as a utopia at all. I mean, I've always assumed this is a dystopic film about a horrible future and, a not so distant future in which they, send rockets to Titan and have all the genetic analysis but can't bother with elevators. Yeah.
I'm sorry. Can you speak more?
Oh, yes, I will. Is that better?
Yes.
Okay.
I think it depends on which brother you are.
Mm-hmm. Exactly, yeah. But, what you're saying is very related to a point that Professor Troy Duster made in the panel that we had on Tuesday, which was that throughout this whole film, there were these isolated acts of resistance by a few people in Vincent Jerome's life. There was, at the end, we see Lamar, doing something, but there's not any hint of collective resistance to this horrible society in which the stratification is written into your genes, whether or not it has any relationship to what you actually are or can do.
It bred resistance out of me.
And, incidentally, I think that in relation to thinking about collective resistance and individual sort of like subversions of the everyday, I read Jerome's and Eugene's relationship in terms of interdependence, right? Even though there was sort of a transactional arrangement in the beginning, it turned into this sort of relational move toward, I don't know, like a collaborative experiment of some sort where both people would get to where they wanted to go. However that ended, right? But there is that. It's not explicit, but it's in there.
But if we, go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry. But then, how would you read the end of the film, where Jerome basically puts himself into a furnace? I feel like he was really there as kind of this appendage-like sort of character, and then when the protagonist, who's the good kind of disabled person, where they can still pass and fit in and have a job, and they can really sort of do it all, but they just need that chance, and they just need to get over this bias that's really invalid. He got to go off into space, and then Jerome, kills himself at the end of the film, right? He does what his purpose is, which was basically to dream through the other character and then leave his genetic material, enough that, Vincent will be able to go on without him, and then that's how the story ends.
And there's the assumption there, I'm glad you brought that up, Dominika. There's the assumption there that when Jerome comes back, he'll continue to be operating as Jerome. There is this moment of reveal where it's hey guys, I'm suddenly, actually not who you thought I was. And there's this no opportunity for thinking of a breakthrough that might happen.
Well, the notion that is reinforced here, that we hear throughout society, I think, is that, he's absolutely right. It's people with disabilities are valued to the extent that we're useful to somebody. Right?
Yeah.
And if somebody doesn't have any sort of use, any sort of purpose, doesn't have a function that is valued within that culture, well, then they're worthless. You don't see them. They disappear, right? They might as well not exist. I remember upon seeing this again, the questions that came to mind were, who gets to try? Who doesn't get to try? Like there's, it's such a fixed system that it reminds me of things like the sheltered workshop system here in the States, where there's a law dating back to 1935 where people with disabilities, by law, are allowed to be paid under minimum wage, and that's okay, because they're not expected to really produce, right? So it's allowable as long as they're fulfilling whatever that function is, but don't expect them to excel. Don't expect them to succeed.
In that sense, I'm sorry.
But it seems like disability is operating at two levels in our conversation, and I kind of wanted to think about them, how they work together. And at one level, it's the representation of disability in the film and the future for people with disabilities. And then there's the other issue that the narrative prosthesis issue. That is, like, is disability really, did he have to be in a wheelchair? Did he have to be disabled for the plot of this film to work? And how central is disability to it? And there's two kinds of disability too. There's his myopia as well. And they kind of are plot turning points that, like, and you get tricked into it. So these two things are kind of operating at two different levels at the same time for us.
And yet he's still using an old E&J wheelchair like you get in a hospital.
And that's almost always the case. I think my favorite part of the show, Speechless, is that the character that is disabled has a chair that finally looks like it was made, I don't know, in this decade. No matter when the movie takes place, the person always has this equipment that's like, from like 50 years ago. So
they have to suffer. I mean,
Exactly.
if they don't suffer, then they're not a good grip.
Well, and there's no point in allocating movie budgets, I guess, to durable medical equipment. Like wheelchairs to say, just like in life, there's no reason to put their resources there. So yeah.
And yet this movie really does have a, there's the ballads and there's the invalids. And so there is a real critique of that kind of thinking. And the idea that when Job says we have discrimination down to a science. So I think that invokes the whole history of scientific abuses, scientific racism, the eugenic sterilization of people often with disabilities. So I think that is all invoked in this film.
Think about the date of the film as well, right? Like I'm like here with Marcy in the sense that overall, yes, there's a bit of a bleak sort of picture and landscape of disability within this film. We look at it through the lens of like the perpetual, like the narrative prosthesis, right? We're looking at disability from that sense and sort of omitting or failing to acknowledge these little acts of resistance, though, that are sort of sprouting throughout the film. And that's kind of what the value of it was for me. Like these little things that were sort of disrupting the narrative that I'm so familiar with. So I was focusing kind of on those moments.
I want to trip off that, what you both said, Marcy and Sara, because one of the things that interests me is the film's construction of particular types, the differences in disability that a number of you have also talked about. The irony is, of course, that Jerome is a valid, right? So if he were to do the pick pick, he would come up as valid. Well, not the original Jerome, Eugene. Whereas Vincent is always invalid. But the interesting thing is that the test, it tests for what we now call a non-apparent disability, which we really didn't talk about in 1997. Non-apparent disabilities, what we used to call invisible disabilities, are really a recent phenomenon and have become something that's exploded greatly. And so I wondered if we could go in this panel to think of this difference between apparent and non-apparent disabilities and how it might either work in this film or in other ways.
Well, I mean, I think sort of what this film is kind of like within the logic of the film, right? Like the protagonist has this non-apparent disability, so it's okay for him to try and be included. to the extent that he can pass, and maybe through his passing, he can sort of show his value in, being able to do what everyone else can do, right? Like there's that moment where, the cops are talking, and I think it was his brother that's like, well, if it was an invalid, they wouldn't have been able to keep up here. Like an invalid cannot be posing as an employee because just inherently, by who they are, they would not be able to do this job, right? But, he can prove and he can try because he didn't save, energy for the swim back, and he just runs across the street because he's so brave, even though he can see. So like he can do these things, like these feats of like kind of super crypto, and those make him work and make him valuable, make him the protagonist of the film. And then you have this other disability hierarchy, and obviously I feel like that irony was very, intentional, that he's a valid, but he's still so like quote unquote broken that even his validness can't save him anymore, right? Because he broke his back. So, that, it's like unredeemable in a way. I mean, the film pretty much says the only way for him to make money, the only way for him to do things in the world is to sell his genetic material. Like there's no talk of him getting a job or having a relationship or doing anything like that. So while the film like means to, flip these hierarchies, I feel like, in some ways it really sort of very much reinforces them. But I do see, I read both of the characters as disabled, and I see it more as this kind of really unintentional comment on the hierarchy of disability, right? Because we weren't really talking so much about, non-apparent disabilities like people are saying in 1997. And something I was just wondering while I was watching the film too is like, how different, or would this movie be any different like if we made it today? Like I don't know, it was just really striking to me, like there's barely any women in the film, there's really no discussion of like any kind of
one person of color.
One person, one mention to race.
Yeah, and the mention to race I thought was really fascinating, right? Because it was like, well, now we have discrimination down to a science, so we don't do that bad kind of discrimination. Now the discrimination is based on science, and it's like, wow. I guess no one's read any history of like racialized discrimination in the United States or anywhere, because that was all linked in and tied up with science, so that was problematic. But it was just really striking to me how like there's no people of color, no women, really no gay people, no trans people, and I don't know if we were to envision a kind of dystopia now that all of that would be absent, but I still question whether you would have this disability hierarchy where the most disabled body was like totally excluded, and that logic is really not questioned within the film.
Yeah,
and I think it was also presented in terms of a binary, even thinking within the idea of hierarchy of disabilities, like there's two bodies that are disabled and no other bodies that are disabled in many other ways are right. To be present, right? So there is this idea of heart failure and myopia. There's this hint of like, because Jerome seems to always, perform this narrative of the supercrip and supercriptum all the time, but it's sort of in relation to his sort of physical stamina that he can really sort of like overcompensate and sort of overcome. There's no mention to the idea of an intellectual disability, for instance, so it's really sort of like very binary and very dichotomous in the sense. So it's either brokenness fully or overcoming and sort of passing, and there's nothing else in between.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. What it did was it challenged those assumptions to the extent that it was convenient
exactly.
for the story,
exactly.
But it didn't go beyond that. I mean, I asked myself, what was the feeling I was left with at the end of the film? And the feeling I was left with at the film is you better know your role, right? and if you try to punch above your weight or do something outside your station, whatever your predetermined station is, that's foolish and folly and futile, and you're screwed. So that's the feeling that you're left with, right? And so to the way. Again, I think it pushes those assumptions just to the degree that it's convenient, and then it conveniently also forgets about them when it's not.
But
No, go ahead.
Doesn't it critique ableism too, though? The whole idea that you would be so valid that you're completely unfunctioning in a way. I mean, all the drone people are completely valid, which is terrifying. I mean, it's just empty and gone and nothing. So it's a critique of disability, but it's also a critique of ability, really.
Sara, you wanted to touch upon
Yeah,
the
I
notion of
wanted
sameness.
I wanted to touch about the notion of sameness and sort of like how that's represented through imagery in the film. If you recall the scene, well, you just watched it, the scene where they're all running next to each other on treadmills, all wearing black, right? So this idea of bodies as sort of appendixes of machines in terms of like the factory line production. So it's all sort of aimed at producing sameness in the body that would then reproduce sameness within the economic system, you know, like the capitalist production system, but that's represented or sort of imaged through the bodies that are all the same. And outside that gym where they're running on the treadmills is like the uniforms, the hair, it's all like very to the like, it seems like this idea of dehumanizing or individualizing, de-individuating to a point where there's no distinction anymore between people, which happens in prisons, right, through uniforms and sort of the other practices. Schools, sort of the way schools are arranged in terms of like very rectangular, sort of like contained spaces. And so that's all like sort of aimed at this linearity in productivity. Like nothing outside of that is really valid.
The one moment of that I really liked in the gym scene is the man in the astronaut training sort of scroll ball, the gyroscope that simultaneously talks on sort of Da Vinci's Vitruvian Man, but also sort of Fordist imageries of production. That I thought was just a beautiful piece of set design. I had a question for Marcy, which was, as the bioethicist on this panel, and part of our rationale for doing it was the 20th year anniversary of Gattaca, but also we're on the edge of what CRISPR may or may not do. And so does CRISPR actually change how we see Gattaca?
Well, I think it's really interesting to reflect on where genetic science was when this movie was made. So this was happening just in the run-up to the mapping of the human genome, which was going to prove that, you know, all of us were the same under the skin, and we should no longer think about race as a biological category, and everyone was going to be shown to have certain genetic anomalies. So, you know, it was going to be this really unifying sort of result from the Human Genome Project. But in fact, what we've seen is very different from that. We've seen a revival of the idea that race is a biological category rather than a social one. We've seen really this idea that we could use genetic technologies not just to read the human genome, but to rewrite the human genome, and that certain people are going to be able to have access to this technology to make them improved or perfect. And you know, when you think about it, there's a couple of different on the surface lessons that this movie is trying to is offering. You know, one is the tagline of the movie. You know, there's no gene for the human spirit. You can be whatever you want, and you know, talk about that. There is no, the tagline of the movie is there is no gene for the human spirit. So that's supposed to be, you know, celebrating what we saw in the protagonist's storyline. But there's also this other storyline there that I think is this, that it's saying that if we allow these technologies to be offered in the world, to be marketed in the world, what we're going to find is that, you know, it doesn't make any difference what you can do or can't do based on whatever your abilities or disabilities are. What's going to matter is the perception of who you are and whether you are valid or not. And if you're valid, then you're going to be in the elite. And I think that it shows us, and this is why this movie is, you know, taken in as a critique of genetic technologies and is really distanced and hated by some people who want to push these genetic technologies, because what it shows us is that the mere perception of different capabilities based on these biological categories could further stratify the already obscene levels of inequality that we live with. And, you know, really, when you think about it, what is racism and what is ableism except the perception that biological categories mean that some people are better than others?
And the practices that further reassert that in the
Right,
everyday.
and the plot reinforces that, right? Because even if you're perceived as invalid, as the Jude Law character is, you end up being, what, drunk, isolated, alone, and in the end, in the incinerator.
Exactly, yeah.
There's a question that we asked the audience on the Tuesday panel that was informative. Who in here has done one of those personal genetic tests, 23andMe or one of the other ones? Raise your hand. So, just a small handful. Yeah. So I think we had about maybe 1 in 10 or fewer of this audience, and at the other one it was more 1 in 6. Or what?
Do you think it's the matter of the conversation that preceded the question? Like,
Oh.
I'm not sure after that conversation, I'm like, yeah, I did
I didn't hear what people felt about the test, if you wanted to share that.
Yes.
Well, at the risk of changing the subject a little
I
bit,
can't hear.
I wanted to ask a little different.
Really just a stereotype about this must be what it feels like to be in a wheelchair all the time, and your life must basically just be really empty and lonely because you're locked away. And you know, I mean, I think it's sort of what Kathy was saying, like, of course the film critiques ableism, but it also reinforces ableism. And I think it reinforces ableism because it's simultaneously very unreflective about the broad spectrum of experiences that disability includes, and it's sort of unreflective about what the lives of people with certain types of disabilities would look like, or what access would mean, and things like that.
There is this one glimmer of disability positives, which is when Uma Thurman and Ethan Hawke go to the concert and they listen to a pianist, and the pianist has 12 fingers, and Ethan Hawke says, "Oh, isn't that something amazing?" And Uma Thurman says, "Well, this is a piece that can only be played by someone with 12 fingers." And so that is the one moment, and then one wonders then, well, will successive parents be modifying their kids for 12 fingers?
And of course, it's not true that the piece can only be played by someone with 12 fingers.
That is until somebody with 14 fingers is born. All right, and then the whole thing starts all over again.
And in regard to what you were just asking, like pointing perhaps to psychiatric disability or mental illness, I mean, I'm not absolutely denying the possibility that that could be intersecting there, but that's actually the point, that there seem to be this very archetypal disability characters, right, that are like one disability and that's it, and they perform then, what Dominika was saying, all the stereotypes that sort of represent that disability. So he could have also been psychiatrically have a psychiatric disability, and we really wouldn't know, right? Like suicide wasn't really tied to the idea of mental illness, really.
Yeah.
It wasn't explored explicitly.
Although one of the testings that was done on Vincent was his propensity towards schizophrenia, that when he had the blood test as a newborn.
I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
I would just, I do think a lot of times it was paper thin, right? Because in the moments when it mattered, you saw the Jude Law character, being very adaptive, using those skills that disabled people have to develop in terms of being able to improvise and sort of fly by the seat of their pants to adapt to a world that was built not with them in mind, right? So when push came to shove, he was really good at that. But and I think it showed that. It didn't explore it though. But I think that question, the feeling that you're left with was, well, hell, if you were Jude Law's character in this universe, right? Hell, I'd be depressed too.
Oh yeah,
Who wouldn't be, right?
Yeah. But it's not explored explicitly.
Right. It's just sort of taken as a given.
Definitely.
So one of the questions that disabled people are often asked aside from why don't you kill yourself,
Yeah.
is
Or if I were you, I would kill
is the question of cure. And so this film is very odd in that it seems that the reparative technology only works on essentially in vitro.
Yeah.
And there is no cure after birth. And I'm wondering how we want as a panelist to think of a cure and the lack of a cure narrative. In some ways, we're all sick of cure narrative films. But this film is pretty bleak in the opposite direction as well.
It really inverts the ideas that like many people, including the Center for Genetics and Society, are putting forward, which is that, look, if somebody is sick and they need to get treated, use these new technologies to treat them. Good, but don't use them to try to improve future generations and have children who are somehow, supposed to be perfect and designed. That we should keep off limits. So this is the opposite.
Well, the thing that it completely ignores is that, again, a lot of things are just conveniently left out. Is there no war in this future, right? Is there no earthquake or flood or sort of natural disaster in this future? Is there, the things that occur, as one ages, the hips go out, the knees go out, the hearing goes, the eyesight, the body starts to break down, generally speaking. What happens? You're either Gore Vidal or Ernest Borgnine.
You are out in space.
Yeah, or you're out in space somewhere.
But it is interesting. There's one piece in there where that's not true, and it's when Vincent, Jerome, whatever, gets a cold, and it's perfectly normal for the Uma Thurman character to say, "Oh yeah, he's sick. He has to go home," and it's like, "Oh yeah, of course he's." And it seems so pedestrian a way to be just like mundanely ill and go home and go sleep in your house in that world, but everybody totally accepted that as oh yeah, of course he's sick.
Well, I just got over the flu and it's a real bastard, so I think it's going to survive. It's like cockroaches. It's going to survive all of it. Okay. But so again, it's to the extent that it's convenient, right? It doesn't think these things through.
Well, this is Hollywood.
Yeah.
Did we learn how the Jude Law character broke his back? I don't recall, sorry.
He was the car.
Yeah, he tried to commit suicide after he got the silver medal.
Oh, I see,
He couldn't believe that given his superior genes that
Oh,
such a thing was
right.
possible.
Yeah.
So this is part of, I think, one of the critiques of the film, that in a world where you're imperfect or you're nothing, that's the alternative and the option that's left for you.
Well,
There's no in between. That's what I'm kind of going back to. There's like this very rigid secondary lines between perfection and imperfection, which are both constructed, right, in the first place. And then there's nothing in between, nothing outside, nothing beyond, nothing else is possible. You cannot imagine a different way of life that is sort of very dualistic experience. I can't get over that.
I mean, I feel like the main character kind of represents that acceptable in between, but even that is very, very limited. If you can strive, if you can look like everybody else, if you can really just overextend yourself, then maybe it's okay to open up that a little, and
I'd be interested in, I see all these things as part of the critique that the movie is making. That the film is critiquing of the possibility of a world in which the combination of new technologies and social stratification produce these kind of horrors in our relationships with our families. The little boy, the little Jerome, the little Vincent couldn't do anything because his mom was always afraid he was going to have a heart attack. He couldn't get into the preschool because they didn't have the insurance. And then the real Jerome, had to step in front of a car to kill himself because he got the silver medal. To me, that all seems like part of the critique of a dystopian possible future that we want to avoid.
I think the question perhaps is, and I keep on going back to that in that context, is disability used as a plot? Is it a storyline? And I'm still not convinced that that's the case because of the very paradoxical nature of this film. Like, it does so many things to like both visualize the disability experience and also erase it or reduce it to this stereotype or category that I'm not really sure. It's like a meta critique. I'm not really sure. I mean, what do you think? You know, it's like I'm confused by that.
I don't know. I feel like there's like a conscious story that the movie is trying to tell, and that's very much what Marcy definitely just laid out for us. It's very much critiquing that. It's very much critiquing this social stratification, but then there's this other like side of the film, this kind of undertone that I don't really think is like this. I don't really think it's like this conscious like desire to make the film like more complex. I really just think it's this failure of imagination, of being able to imagine a spectrum of disability and more complex disabled characters.
Absolutely.
So like the film kind of undoes itself in that way, right? Like all the things that we've been pointing out about the Jude Law character. So I don't really feel like absolutely it's critiquing all those things. It's just also, I mean, you know, it's so sort of obvious, I hate to say like unwittingly, but like it's inadvertently reinforcing those things, which also makes me think too about how much those attitudes that seem to really undercut the message of the film had to do with the unquestioned attitudes that were then accepted and are probably still pretty much accepted in society towards how we view disabled bodies and disabled lives, like at least once they cross a certain threshold of social assimilation, I guess.
I wanted to ask a slightly different question, which is the one on privacy and policing. I think many disabled people are used to the constant policing, and we're constantly seen as potential fraudsters and who must be evaluated and reevaluated and reevaluated, monitored, and poked and pricked and confined in 2 little boxes to make sure we don't escape and run amok. And we have, you know, there's currently, I think, Dominika, I think, has written on this, we currently have a bill, don't we, that's going through to get personal care attendants have to be GPS monitored, and the end result of that is going to be that disabled people who are using care attendants, locations themselves will also be monitored. I was wondering if we could talk about this notion of surveillance and how surveillance and typing works.
And I also, I just want to clarify, I'm by no means like a major authority on this, but that's actually happening in other states already. Like Ohio has these GPS devices, and if you get money from the state to receive care in your home, you have to use one of them. And there's really no, because I don't think people really get this. Like if you're disabled and you need significant in-home care, there's really no other way to get that care unless you can finance it out of your own pocket, because insurance companies don't cover that type of care generally. They only cover like nursing homes and stuff like that. So this is already happening in some parts of the country. So it's not so hypothetical, and it's something that affects a lot of people who you know, can't fund it themselves, with most people who are not, you know, wealthy.
One thing that really caught my attention regarding this idea of policing and surveillance and gatekeeping is the character of the doctor who takes the samples. And so he seems like one of this, like, perhaps sort of like infiltrated or sort of turned.
You mean the doctor in Gattaca?
The doctor in Gattaca, yeah, the one who takes the tests, samples, and all that, who's also shown talking to Vincent or Jerome, and sort of how that character that's like representation of gatekeeping then turns when he finds out that his son is also being marked as invalid. And that's when he realizes Jerome isn't Jerome, but he still says, go on. You know, go on into space, because I understand, or sort of like I cannot relate now. And to me, that's sort of the idea that touches on the idea that people can only relate to us as disabled people when there's someone in their lives who's also disabled or has become disabled. Oh, now I understand, because someone that I love goes through this, right? Not because I validate and recognize your own lived experiences, you tell it, but because someone here in my life, right? Their experience is valid, and therefore yours must be too.
Yeah, and that's the sense I got in terms of the depth and breadth of the movie. That you know, I don't know, the extent of it was sort of like the person who wrote it, you know, might have knew someone with a vision impairment, but they didn't know a quadriplegic.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And so
Or a neurodivergent person.
neurodivergent person or somebody with Down syndrome or whatever it is, right? Their understanding only went so far, and it was sort of revealed in the story that was told.
So I have a question whether or not it would be different, the whole thing, if these people were girls rather than boys that were like being tested, and you know, suppose you just flipped all the characters and it was all about women, and there was one man that was kind of in the story, and I know we said that, but I'm wondering what the resonance of it would be, or you know, you could change some other characteristic like race or you know, whatever. It was all white or all people of color, and then like one white person that was doing a test. What would that message be? Like what?
That's a great
Well, like
one.
Wakanda, like what?
Like Wakanda.
Like a token character.
Yeah.
We're the token. I didn't understand.
Oh, she said
Oh,
it
I
would be like Wakanda in Black Panther, where we
Black
just had-
Panther, the film.
where we just had two Tolkien characters, white characters.
White characters in the world, yeah. That's sort of subversion.
And the disabled one's the evil character, but that's another story.
Again,
But that-
was
But
it?
he's also
Did it matter? Did it matter that it was
Oh,
men
sorry.
rather than women?
Ooh, that's sorry. I'm so sorry.
I do want to touch upon Kathy's question, because our panel is also different from Tuesday in that it's a majority female. So would this narrative work if it wasn't all white men?
I don't understand. How
Would Gattaca have worked if the protagonists were not all white men?
I think it can't, because I think that the privileged characters, the maleness of them and the whiteness of them, and there are a few comments on race in this film, like the technician in the fertility clinic, if you remember, way back at the beginning.
Yeah.
Oh, you like a
fair skin.
child with these color eyes and pale skin, fair skin, yeah. So there's a little bit of that. But I think that it is more built into the structure of the movie and the dystopic vision that the ideal is the young, fit, intelligent, white
man.
guy. Yeah.
Heterosexual.
And I was trying.
Less gender.
And I was trying to imagine how it would be different if, let's just pick one category. Let's say the gender was reversed, right? How would that be different? And I was thinking, well, in this dystopian universe, would all women be expected to have the measurements of Barbie? Like you know, like.
They would not be sent into space.
Well, that's what I was just thinking. I don't even know if we could recognize it as a, sorry, go ahead. I was just thinking that I don't even know if we could recognize it as a dystopia, because that's also what I was thinking. There's no way, like, even now, there is not a room full of women going off into space. Like, it's 20 years later, and we do not have that now. So we would be like, this is awesome, yay feminism, and then it would just really confuse the message that, like, we're supposed to see this as bad. So, no, I don't think it will work. Oh yeah, but even like feminism, right? Like people would be snapping their fingers about that, because even now, that would be like, we don't have enough women in science to realistically have a whole spaceship of women going up into space. That would already have to be some kind of like weird white feminist fantasy, like, and that's how the film would be regarded. I don't know if we'd be talking about it in this big a forum like 20 years later. It would be a big studio film. No way. Maybe now, but not then.
I have some good news, which is the percentage of women who are CEOs of Fortune 500 companies has reached an all-time high. We're making real advances. It now stands at 5.4%.
Think about that.
Why don't we pivot now to audience questions? I know there were a couple. Oh, I'm sorry.
I was going to have another little factoid.
Go ahead. While we get the mic. So raise your hand. We'll want the mic, but Marcy has a
Here's the factoid. I learned when I was poking around about Gattaca and the reaction to it in the 20 years since it was released, that in 2011, NASA released two lists of the most realistic and the least realistic science fiction films of all time. And the #1 most realistic science fiction film was Gattaca.
Great. I've just been told that we only have time for a few audience questions, so I think the mic has already gone out.
I've had to see the film 4 times this month, so and every time I watch, my queer crip ass every single time is like, there's no heterosexual explanation for Eugene.
Yeah.
You've seen it. I mean, there's nothing straight going on there. So my question is really, what role in sort of this endless production, or I guess reproductive labor that we see Eugene continually performing, what role does desire play in his life
Oh, yeah.
at all,
Yeah.
if any?
Oh, I love that. I think desire plays no role in Gattaca at all. Like, this idea of sameness, that we are like devoid of desire because we are producing machines, is sort of like everywhere in this film. Like, even in the sort of like very sanitized, did you get tired of like seeing Jerome scratch himself and try to like not leave traces of his invalidness, as he says so, in the valid world, and sort of this like medicalizing spatial arrangement, right? Everything is clean, everything is sanitized, everything is permanently being. Do you remember when the detective says, "Oh, you couldn't find anything here on the floor because of the way because they what's the word in English? They clean it all every day." So it's like this idea of a world devoid of any form of difference, not even imperfection, just difference. And that's sort of the structure, the architecture, the characters. I don't know, it seems a lot. To me, it was really tiresome. Well, there's no desire fantasy. There's just.
Well, the other brief moment of desire was the doctor at Gattaca admiring Jerome's penis.
There's a way in which that for all the focus on bodies and the perfectibility or unacceptableness of bodies in this film, it's really about a disembodiment that doesn't really exist very much. But there are these moments of human connection that I think do stand in for any possibility of resistance to this horrible stratified machine-like world.
I think we have time for one more question.
And then quick answers. It's like hard stuff.
Family bread being thrown out.
Yeah, so I'd like to go back to some of the earlier conversation. I know that on Tuesday, Professor Duster dropped this idea of a cognitive map. And so in the earlier conversations, I'm wondering whether or not the dilemmas with the film were reflective of people's inability to transcend their cognitive map. And then that's also related to the resource allocation issues that are both present in the film, but also in society. So if the goal is to not be in the same conversation 20 years later, how do we begin to approach or to think about shifting people's cognitive maps in terms of the way that we think about valuing human existence in hierarchically? How do we broaden that framework?
Well, I think in terms of media representation, like it's starting to happen a little bit. I think less so maybe with disability than other categories, but like if you look at the media that's being made now, I mean, there's more representation of people of color, there's more representation of queer, like there's more representation of other identities, and I think that's kind of how it happens slowly over time. Like I was watching Netflix because I was sick or something, so I watched a bunch of Netflix, and there was like a gay character in like 3 shows in a row, and it was just like, oh, here's a gay character. And you know, I mean, when I was finishing high school and like Ellen was on TV, if you came out, you got canceled. I mean, there was no, like, yes, gay people existed, but there's no way you'd see them like on TV. That was insane. So I see that kind of, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have said that, but it was just kind of, it wasn't on people's cognitive map. So I think slowly those things are shifting, and I'd like to see them shift more and faster and include people with disabilities in a more meaningful way than they do now. I mean, even if you think about the recent Oscars, right, there was lots of mention of different kinds of diversity, but I think, you know, disability still isn't really thought of as part of that representational platform that we need to include. you know.
And I would also say that, you know, how do you do that? You got to show people what they don't expect. You got to give them something different, right? So in talking about diversity in terms of something like the Oscar, there's a lot of attention given to a film like Shape of Water, which had a character that was nonverbal but used sign language, and there was a lot of talk about the casting. There's not quite as much talk about the fact that the film that won the narrative short was about a deaf child learning sign language, which would sort of be her native language, and the documentary short was about a woman with a psychiatric disability. And that those were very nuanced and very favorable in terms of disability identity, disability community, all those different things. So I think what we have to kind of do is find a new way to frame the question, you know, and so what you can say is, people can talk about disability, but disability puts the D in diversity. It's right there at the beginning of the word. You know, it's not at the end, it's not an afterthought, it's not something you do when Karen gets pissed off, right?
But anyway, you know what?
I'm so sorry, but the organizer,
Autism misrepresentation.
yes, the organizer looks like she's about to have a heart attack. I think it's probably good. And she was noted to be 65% risk of a heart attack. So thank you very much.
Thanks for coming.
Yeah, an event that goes overtime is a successful event. Thank you.